Welcome to week 2. This week will be on abstract objects. So we ended our week on laws of nature with Dretski's argument that in order to understand laws of nature, we need to believe in universals. That laws of nature about the refractive index of diamonds are not actually talking about any particular diamond or the set of all diamonds. They're talking about the property of diamondness, which is an independent thing. Well, that seems a little strange, right? What is this property of diamondness? Where would I see it? What sort of thing is it? And this week is all explaining what universals are, what the arguments for the independent existence of universals and other abstract objects would be. Other abstract objects might include numbers. Arguments for and against. So those who favor the existence of abstract objects will be called Platonists because Plato invented the idea of universals in about 400 BC. And then the opponents of Platonism will be called nominalists. I've never really found a great reason why they're called that. I think probably because universals exist in name only, they're saying, or something like that. So Michael Devitt, it's a beginning of a subject like this. There's a few, important articles that you need to read, but they all sort of refer to each other in a strange way. So it was hard to pick which one to go with first. So this Devitt one sort of talks about quine a bit, and then we're going to read the actual quine. But I think this is the best approach, right? So Devitt also looks back to Plato, who sort of provided this sort of argument. So he says, here's an argument that people have offered for Platonism, right? For the view that universals exist. It goes like this. Premise 1, Mars is red. Premise 2, the Golden Gate Bridge is red. Premise 3, from 1 and 2, therefore there is something that Mars and the Golden Gate Bridge have in common, which is redness. Therefore, redness exists. And here we mean redness as a universal, right? Something independent of Mars and the Golden Gate Bridge, right? A single thing that they both share. Now, why? Well, because we don't want to just say that Mars and the Golden Gate Bridge are similar in color. We want to say they're the same color, right? We want to say that some things have the same property, not just similar properties. In order to say that, then it must be something independent that they both sort of participate in. Here's another way to understand another approach for the same conclusion, a slightly different argument. This is a abductive argument, which we call inference to the best explanation. You may have encountered those sorts of arguments in critical thinking or logic, but it goes like this. Mars and the Golden Gate Bridge resemble each other. The best explanation of that fact is that they have something in common, redness. Therefore, redness exists. So maybe for that abductive arguments, they're not deductive. So if there's a better explanation out there, then we would go for that, right? So it doesn't give a certain conclusion, right? But it's an argument that probably this is a conclusion. If that's the best argument, then we should believe the conclusion, right? Or, sorry, if that's the best explanation. Okay, so these are two different arguments for universals. I think the Dretski argument is maybe even more compelling, right? That's why I led with that, right? Dretski's argument basically is if we want to have laws of nature, we're going to need to believe in universals. And that feels to me a little bit more compelling than trying to explain why the Golden Gate Bridge and Mars are both red, right? That's the sort of metaphysical argument that sometimes makes people scoff. So that's exactly why I started with laws of nature. Okay, so yeah, we saw Dretski said, look, the best account of laws of nature, the one that makes the most sense of the way we conceive of laws, it seems like we have to have universals. We need to talk about diamondness independent of any particular diamond, right? And diamondness, it seems, existed before, right? So laws of nature are like, have been around since the beginning of the universe. There was a point when there were no diamonds in the universe, right? They came to be after the Earth formed, or various planets formed. Maybe there's diamonds on other planets, and certain types of pressure, right, were applied to carbon. So the laws are around, and thus the universals are around before there were any objects that we would call diamonds, right? Before there were any red objects, and so on. And Presumably, if all the diamonds were destroyed, there would still be a law of nature governing them. These are objects that are independent of any actual existing objects. They exist in some other realm, and we call them abstract objects. They're not physical, but they exist in a non-physical way. We're going to see that numbers are another type of abstract object. Uh, the number three we don't encounter in everyday life. We never see the number three. We see sets of three things, right? But that's distinct from the number three, or so some claim. And so where do numbers exist? Up with the universals in some other non-spatiotemporal realm, right? So again, this is called Platonism because Plato was the person that invented the idea of the realm of, he called them the forms, right? We're taking a course on Plato. So that was around 400 BC, and the view is still around. It's strangely compelling and necessary. Okay, so we want to talk about ontological commitment. So ontology is what exists, right? And so an ontological commitment is a commitment to what sorts of things exist. And in metaphysics, we often read our ontological commitments off of the sentences or propositions that we take to be true, right? So if I say my dog is going to the vet, implicitly I am saying I believe my dog exists, right? And I believe that exists. Now, I might also say Santa wears a red hat, right? I don't necessarily believe in Santa, so that becomes its own little thorny problem that we won't be able to get into in too much detail. But at least some of the sentences that we say do imply, right, a commitment to the existence of certain things. So, one way to get around the problems like Santa wears a red hat that metaphysicians have tried. Well, look, a given sentence in English can be rephrased in any number of ways, right? In some ways will imply a commitment to the existence of things, and other ways will not. So if I want to say that David Copperfield, right, a Dickens character, is clever, right? If I say David Copperfield is clever, that seems like I'm committed to the existence of David Copperfield. But if I say the main character in the story of David Copperfield is clever, well, now I'm just committed to a character in a story, right? So you can often rephrase things in different ways that will make different ontological commitments. So the question is, can we get around, is there any way to get around the one over many argument, right? Do we need to exist, or do we need to believe in universals? Can we rephrase things? Because typically this is sort of a default assumption in metaphysics, is like, if we could stick with like just the world of the physical, that would be nice, right? We don't even know what these non-spatiotemporal objects are supposed to be. Sounds pretty suspect. We tend to like simpler theories, right? This is Occam's razor. So there's going to be a default assumption of like, if we could restrict our ontological commitments, that is preferable. What's going on with this argument and the one over many argument, right, or the inference of the best explanation, Platonism? What are we really committed to here? So suppose we say A and B have the same property, right? Mars and the Golden Gate Bridge are both red. So A and B have the same property, Fness. Fness just stands for redness or diamondness or whatever the heck, right? So on the face of it, the surface grammar does seem to commit us to the existence of Fness, right? If I say Mars is red and Golden Gate Bridge is red, are they both have the same property of redness? It seems like I'm saying redness exists, right? But what if I say, so there's two different ways to phrase this, right? So one is to say Mars and the Golden Gate Bridge both have the property of redness, and that seems to be definitely I'm saying redness exists. But what if I just say Mars and the Golden Gate Bridge are red? Does that also commit me to the existence of redness or not? The Platonists will say yes, it does, and that's the whole point of the one over many argument, as they say we need some explanation, right, of A being red and A being F and B being F. They need to say it seems like they must have something in common if Fness is the exact same thing that they both have, right? Now, 2 being the claim that right Mars and the Golden Gate Bridge are both red. If the Platonist is asking us to explain that, and if they're saying that the best explanation is that redness exists, you might say, well, Mr. Platonist, here's another explanation. Isn't this just as good? Maybe I can explain, right, that both A and B are F by the fact that A is F, right, premise 3 here, and the fact that B is F, right? Doesn't that also explain why A and B are both F? Now, Platonists will say, no, that's just a trick, right? Doesn't really explain anything, right? What we need the existence of Fness to explain even 3 and 4, right? But if that's the case, right, if that's the next move the Platonist makes, then they don't really need the whole 1 over many argument, right? Because they're saying, I need Fness just to explain why A is F, right? So we could really just say, premise 1, Mars is red, 2, therefore redness exists. The best explanation of why Mars is red is that redness exists. In the end, right, this is what the Platonist is claiming. We need redness to exist, the universal redness to exist, even to explain anything having any property, right? So when we get into Quine, and Devitt talks about Quine here, Quine has his own criterion of ontological commitment, and he says it only applies to singular terms, right? So what is a singular term? So tiny little tutorial in predicate logic here, complicated. So Mars is red, right? I could translate that into logic language with a capital R, lowercase m, right? So the lowercase m is a singular term. So those pick out particular objects. They can be names, right? So the little m stands for Mars, right? And the capital R is a predicate, and that's a property that Mars has. So capital R, little m means Mars is red, right? In logic language. So Quine says, I take all my sentences, right, and convert them into logic language, I'm only committed to the existence of the little letters, the singular terms. So here, when I say Mars is red, I'm committed to the existence of Mars, but I'm not committed to the existence of properties. That's just a brute fact. That doesn't need explanation. So Armstrong, someone who we're not reading, but who Devitt talks about, says of Quine, he says, Quine's right, criterion of ontological commitment is Ostrich Nominalism, which means, so again, nominalism is the claim that universals don't exist, right? And the ostrich part is pejorative, right? He's putting Quine down and he's saying, you've just stipulated, right, that I only have to be committed to singular terms and I don't have to explain why objects have properties. He says, Quine, you're just sticking your head in the sand, right? You're refusing to explain something and saying it's just a brute fact that objects have properties. Whereas Quine says, well, there are some brute facts, right? Explanation has to stop somewhere, and the fact that objects have properties is as good a one as any, right? So if you accept Quine's view, then yeah, when I say Mars is red, I accept the existence of objects, and objects just have properties, but there's no need to explain them, so I don't have to posit universals to explain that. So let's give the Platonists their due here, and try to take some time to figure out what they mean, right? When they say no Quine, right, you're like an ostrich, you're putting your head in the sand. We do need to explain why Mars is red. So what could that explanation look like? And Devitt runs down a few possibilities. If you want to explain why Mars is red, you might be asking what caused Mars to be red. You might be asking for what purpose is Mars red, right? Neither of those seem to be the kind of explanation Platonists are asking for, right? For what purpose Mars is red, it might be no purpose at all, or I don't know, if you believe in God, maybe God did it for a purpose, right? But that's not what they're getting at when they say we need redness. I mean, that explanation doesn't involve the universal redness at all. Similarly, with what caused Mars to be red, it's not that redness causes Mars. So the universal, right? The the relationship between universals and the properties that objects have is not a causal one, right? First of all, universals are not in space and time, so they're not involved in causation at all, right? Causation is a event between physical objects or objects in space-time, right? So neither one or two could be what the nominalist, I'm sorry, what the Platonist is looking for here when they say, no, no, Quine, you need to explain why Mars is red. You can't just say it's a brute fact. Okay, well, there's another couple possibilities. Number three might be what constitute Mars being red. So this isn't a causal explanation, but it's just like what other properties does Mars have, right, that constitute its redness? And in that case, it would be, yeah, the reflectance properties of the surface, right? What wavelengths of light does it reflect? Um, that's strictly speaking not a causal relationship; it's a constitutive relationship. When you have certain reflectance properties, you just are red, right? They don't cause you to be red. So in that case, we're explaining why Mars is red by explaining something else. We're explaining why A is F by saying, well, A is G, right? And another possibility is we might just be asking about the semantics of the word red. What makes it the case that the word red applies to Mars? Well, if the question is number four, if it's a semantic one, that's not metaphysics, right? That's just a question about how English works. And again, we don't need to posit the universal redness, right, as an abstract object in order to explain how English works. So it seems like the only option is number three, right? Some sort of reductivist answer, right? Explaining Mars's redness in virtue of some other property that it has. So why are both animals in this cage in the zoo tigers? Presumably, that sort of answer, a number three type answer, would have to do with their DNA, right? So is that what the Platonist means? Probably not, right? Because that explanation doesn't involve a universal either, right? It says, why is Mars red? And it just refers to some other property and on down the line, right? It still doesn't talk about universals. So we've gone through all four ways that you might reasonably explain something, right? Be they causal or teleological, that's the purpose thing, right? Or constitutive or semantic. And it seems like none of those are the type of explanation that the Platonist is insisting universals give us, right? And if that's the case, then they're not doing so much better than the Ostrich Nominalists, right? The Platonist is sort of putting their head in the sand too, and they say, no, it needs an explanation, and the explanation is universals. Okay, but is that really explaining anything, right? Or at least anything more than what Quine is saying when he says it's just a brute fact. So, right, the Platonist insists that A being F, Mars being red, or whatever, needs an explanation, but it's not one of the four kinds of explanation we saw, right? It's some kind of special kind of explanation that only universals can tell us, and that seems to be satisfactory to them, even though it doesn't really say much except that the universal exists, right, in some some non-spatiotemporal realm. And then we might ask, well, does the fact that Mars, if you say, so if I'm explaining why is Mars red? Because Mars participates in the universal redness. And should I then be able to ask, oh, well, why does Mars participate in the universal redness? The Platonist isn't going to say much, right? So they seem to think that explanation stops pretty soon too, and it stops after one more step and after another step that's not particularly helpful, right? So all they've really done is multiply, right, the number of entities in the universe by a lot and by a new category that it's hard to understand because it's non-physical, right? And Occam's razor tells us don't multiply entities beyond necessity. Let's stick with the minimum ontology. We need to explain the world. Universals are inflating our ontology quite a bit. They don't seem to do much more explanatory work, and so this is what Devitt calls mirage realism, right? And it's kind of the counter to Ostrich Nominalism, which says the explanatory power of universals is just a mirage. It only gives the illusion. Okay, so if you're convinced by Devitt, right, that the one over many argument is not particularly convincing, right, there is another argument that Quine is going to offer that will seem to, even if we accept Quine's criterion of ontological commitment and we say, no, right, we don't need universals to explain how things have properties, we might still be stuck with abstract objects because sometimes abstract objects feature as singular terms, right, in sentences that we believe to be true. So there's lots of different, also part of it depends on how we phrase things, right? But if I say something like red resembles orange more than it resembles blue, I'm not talking about a red object here. I'm talking about red, the color, right? And I'm using it as a singular term, right? So this seems to entail that I believe in red, the color, independent of any red objects. If I say 3 is prime, I'm using the number 3 as a singular term, right? In logic language, that would be capital P, little t, right? What is the number 3, right? I seem to be committed to the existence of the number 3 here, and so on. He has the same virtues as his father. Virtues, thought of as a universal, seems to be committed to here. So maybe if you want to be a nominalist, right, you could go through the English language and rephrase all of these in a way so that, right, things like 3, the number 3 doesn't show up as a singular term anywhere. That's going to be particularly hard with numbers, right? And particularly because, again, back to science, numbers are all tied up in science, right? So the laws of nature, doing science requires numbers, and we will often use numbers in what appears to be as singular terms, right? So in the next lecture, I'll get into that in more detail. So even if you think Devitt has sort of cleverly avoided the one over many argument, right, and the worries about the existence of diamondness, still it's going to turn out if we want to do science, we need numbers, and it's much harder to get rid of numbers as abstract